Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're attempting something, well, something pretty ambitious. We're going to try and set aside history as just a list of names, dates, and events.
Yeah, and instead look at it as a kind of stack of inherited structural problems.
Exactly. Our mission here is to trace the hidden theological blueprints, the genealogy, if you will, of some of the most persistent dilemmas we all face in modern life.
It's such an essential project because it forces you to challenge your most comfortable assumptions about what modernity even is.
Right.
We've all been told this simple story that modernity is this glorious straight-line triumph of human reason and the total retreat of medieval religion.
But the sources we've been digging into suggest something far more complex and, frankly, a lot more anxious. And I think that brings us to the central puzzle that really kicks off our deep dive today. Why is it that we, modern people, with all this unparalleled technical power and rational capacity, I mean, we can map the human genome, we can calculate orbital trajectories, why do we constantly face these deep, persistent crises?
Crises of meaning, crises of legitimacy.
And the seemingly intractable dilemma of how to balance human freedom against societal order. It never seems to get solved.
And the core assertion here is that these aren't external random problems that we just haven't figured out yet. They are, in fact, structural byproducts.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if the very foundations of modern thought, the bedrock of our science, our state, and even our sense of a subjective self, if all that is built from the rubble of broken theological arguments, then the rational solutions we adopted, no matter how brilliant they seem, will necessarily carry those original structural flaws within them.
So, to even start, we had to critique that traditional, simple secularization theory. The idea that says modernity is just this straightforward, progressive story where reason wins and religion just fades away.
That single-line narrative is the problem, really. Its simplicity is deceptive. The sources we're looking at demonstrate that the shift wasn't a clean break at all, but a messy, centuries-long process of substitution, of migration, and relabeling.
So it's not that religious ideas disappeared, they just changed clothes.
Exactly. If concepts as fundamental as political sovereignty, natural law, and subjective certainty all have these deep theological roots, then religion didn't retreat. Its foundational structures were simply translated into new, secular languages.
And once that foundational transcendent divine order is no longer secure, the moment the theological ground starts to shake, say in the 14th century, modern thought had to frantically answer a whole cluster of persistent questions.
Yes.
These are the post-order collapse problems that really define the next several centuries of philosophy and politics.
Exactly. Modern thinkers weren't just debating in a vacuum, they were scrambling to fill an intellectual one. They had to ask, does the world retain any intrinsic order now that God's direct, rational presence feels less certain? Or is it just a random collection of events?
And how is human free will and moral responsibility even possible if God's absolute will is the only real driving force in the universe?
And, most critically for common life, what is the foundation for social legitimacy? If that divine order no longer provides a shared, universal standard of what is good, how do we agree on how to live together? These are the problems that shattered the medieval world, and you could argue they remain unresolved today.
And this leads right into what the sources are calling the contradictory essence of modernity. This idea that the intense and very successful pursuit of certainty, whether it's scientific, administrative, or philosophical, often ends up kind of inadvertently eroding both freedom and meaning.
It's the ultimate trade-off, isn't it? The explanatory power of science is vast. I mean, we know how everything works with incredible precision.
Right.
But the moment we achieve that clarity, we realize it completely fails to provide purpose or value direction. It cannot tell us why we should live or what goal is worthy of pursuit. And this internal tension between this vast explanation and the profound value vacuum it creates is the relentless engine of modern anxiety.
Okay, so if this isn't a story of clean breaks, but of a really complex inheritance, what's the methodology we're using to trace this lineage? The basic assumption we're starting with is that key modern concepts aren't entirely new inventions. They're more like restagings or replacements or migrations of those ancient theological dilemmas.
And the sources provide a brilliant analytical tool to understand this process, which they call the translation framework. And this allows you, the listener, to sort of categorize how these profound shifts happen across different domains: ontology, epistemology, politics. It's a really useful lens.
Let's start with the first mechanism, which is maybe the most obvious one: substitution. Just a straightforward replacement of roles.
Yeah, this is when the ultimate role, once held by a transcendent God, gets replaced by a new absolute. So you can think of the Enlightenment subject,
Mhm.
the mathematically proven natural laws, or the iron grip of the sovereign state. They are substituted into that ultimate position to perform the function of ultimate certainty or ultimate authority or ultimate moral guidance.
They're essentially the new CEOs of the universe.
That's a great way to put it. The second mechanism is internalization.
Okay.
This is where the transcendent divine order, which used to be sort of written across the cosmos, gets transferred inward into human consciousness itself. So instead of receiving moral or rational order from some external hierarchy or a celestial source, we find it inside us, in our subjective rational structure, our autonomous will, or the self-certifying conscience.
That's a huge shift. It makes us individually responsible for cosmic order.
And an immense burden.
Yeah.
Now, at least the next one, naturalization.
Okay.
Here, theological or metaphysical orders are subtly rewritten as objective, often mechanical or causal, structures. The divine dimension just recedes. For example, God's reason is no longer this spiritual principle you can access by analogy. It becomes the mathematically predictable laws of motion. The world is just viewed as a system of predictable, quantifiable rules.
Like Newtonian physics, which basically describes creation as the work of a very efficient, but maybe a somewhat distant clockmaker.
The clockmaker God, exactly. And finally, the mechanism that really defines modern statecraft: technicalization or governance.
Right.
This is the pragmatic shift in what we're concerned about. The ultimate concern for, say, saving the soul and cultivating virtue gets transformed into this worldly risk management, social control, and institutional design. We move from pursuing the highest virtue-saving souls to pursuing the most efficient control.
Social controllability and security.
Yes. The political goal becomes the avoidance of the worst evil chaos, death, rather than the achievement of the highest good virtue, salvation. It's a lowering of the stakes, but for very practical reasons.
That roadmap substitution, internalization, naturalization, and technicalization, that's our key for understanding this story. It frames modernity not as a smooth ascent, but as this continuous, anxious process of rebuilding the structural relationship between God, man, and nature.
And this structural framework lets us see immediately that the crises we experience are not random external accidents. They are structural byproducts of the solutions we implemented using these translation mechanisms.
So every substitution or internalization solved one historical problem.
But, by its very nature, created a new, profound internal tension that persists today.
Okay, let's begin at the beginning then. The world before the rupture. The stable baseline of the old order. We're moving now to the first part of our historical audit, really defining the sheer stability of the structure of the old order. Medieval scholasticism. Before we can talk about the world shattering, we have to understand why it held together so firmly in the first place.
Yeah, and the sources describe this as a very self-consistent and stable system built upon what they call a threefold binding.
A threefold binding, I like that phrase.
It really captures the integrative power of the scholastic worldview. So at the ontological layer, the world was understood as a teleological and hierarchical whole.
Okay, let's break down teleological.
It means everything was structured toward an ultimate purpose, a telos. Everything operated according to the chain of being, moving toward its divinely prescribed ultimate end. The universe wasn't just a place for stuff to happen. It was inherently meaningful, it was value-laden and purposeful. It was never value-neutral.
So meaning was a given. You didn't have to invent meaning, you participated in it.
Precisely. Your life had an assigned role within this vast cosmic rational drama, and the certainty flowed directly into the epistemological layer, the theory of knowledge.
Right.
Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas believed rationality and faith were not enemies. They were harmonious paths to the same truth. Humans could know the truth through what they called the analogy of being, this belief that the created world, like a shadow, reflects the intelligible, rational order of its creator.
So because the world was created by a rational God, it was knowable through human reason.
Yes, it was good and rational. It was designed to be understood.
It sounds like they had an implicit guarantee that the world wasn't trying to trick them.
They did. Their reason was trustworthy because it mirrored God's reason. It was participating in a larger divine logic, and this certainty flowed right into the ethico-political layer.
So society itself was structured by this.
Absolutely. Goodness, virtue, and social life were rooted in natural law, which was itself rooted in God's creation. Societal legitimacy stemmed from conforming to this divine universal order. Politics wasn't about power management or balancing interests. It was about ordering earthly happiness as a necessary step toward achieving the highest good.
Ethics and politics were inextricably linked to a cosmic purpose.
They were one and the same, really, and the crucial distinction here, which serves as our necessary counterpoint for everything that comes later, is the premise of world intelligibility. It wasn't the modern desire for quantifiable data. The medieval world aimed for meaning-based intelligibility, understanding the why and the purpose. Imagine looking at a medieval cathedral. They understood its purpose, to glorify God, to instruct the faithful through its art.
Whereas we would want to know the engineering specs.
Exactly. We would want to know the how and the cause. That's quantifiable calculability. We want to measure the stress tolerances of the stone, the chemical composition of the mortar, the mathematical efficiency of the arch. They wanted to know what it meant.
So the universe, in the scholastic view, was inherently endowed with purpose a priori. Facts contained their values.
It was impossible to separate the two. And that is the ultimate takeaway for you, the listener, from this section. The metaphysical transcendent order provided the world with its ultimate moral and existential foundation. It linked individual life, politics, and the cosmic order into a highly stable and certain whole. The stability is the high watermark against which all subsequent crises of modern thought are measured.
That foundation was certain, shared, and cosmic.
And then it fractures. We now enter the rupture point, the nominalist revolution of the 14th century. This shift, driven largely by William of Ockham, shatters that stable, beautiful scholastic system and creates the existential problems that will come to define the next 600 years.
This sounds less like a revolution and more like an intellectual earthquake.
It was precisely that. Nominalism is characterized by a radical shift, starting with ontology, the very nature of being. Ockham radically denied the reality of universals.
Okay, what does that mean in practical terms?
Scholasticism believed there was a real, shared, essence-like humanness that existed outside of individual humans. Nominalism said, no, only individuals are real. Universals are just names we use, hence nominalism. They're convenient labels, not real things.
So, instead of being a continuous ordered tapestry where every thread connects to a larger design, the world suddenly becomes
an atomized collection of particulars, independent individuals. It's like a pile of unique bricks rather than a cathedral designed by a single architect. The cosmos loses its intrinsic, connecting, rational unity.
And this massive shift was driven by a radical new view of God.
Yes, Ockham emphasized God's absolute will and omnipotence to an extreme degree. He argued that God is unbound by human notions of rationality and necessity or even internal consistency.
So God is pure power.
Pure, untethered will. The will of God replaced the old rational net that structured the cosmos. God's creation is simply a free arrangement based on arbitrary power, not a necessary logical structure. He could, theoretically, command us to hate him, and that would instantly become the ultimate good.
Wait, if God's will is primary and totally unpredictable, doesn't that make human reason almost useless in trying to decipher the cosmos?
Absolutely. This immediately impacted epistemology. If God's will is arbitrary, human reason's ability to grasp universal, necessary truth is fundamentally doubted. You can no longer rely on deduction from some assumed innate universal order.
You can't infer God's rationality from the world's order.
Because God's will is unfathomable. So what is left? What can you trust? You must rely on immediate empirical observation and tentative hypothesis. The seeds of the empirical scientific method were sown right here, born from theological anxiety and the despair of ever truly knowing God's purpose.
And if God's will is arbitrary, ethics must have been totally cut adrift.
They were. Good and evil became solely dependent on God's command. This is called voluntarism. The good is good only because God willed it to be so, not because of the inherent nature or purpose of the thing itself. This will-based ethic shattered the shared foundational consensus of what constitutes the good.
It's the beginning of value pluralism in moral conflict.
Yes, the first crack in the foundation. And so we see the full outbreak of crisis. First, world order instability. The cosmos loses its inherent necessity and purpose. It becomes contingent and accidental. Nature can no longer supply moral or teleological guidance because, for all we know, God might change it tomorrow.
You can't read God's purpose through the natural world anymore.
You can only get it through revealed scripture or direct faith, which leads to the second crisis, epistemological anxiety. Without that stable, rational cosmic structure, objective certainty is lost. Skepticism becomes a perfectly rational response to the understanding that God's will is unfathomable by our limited human reason. The crisis isn't just ignorance, it's the unsettling of the very foundation of knowledge.
And this creates immediate ethico-political consequences.
Of course, the shared moral foundation is suspended, making social legitimacy precarious. The breakdown of a communal concept of the highest good forces politics to search for a new and probably arbitrary source of order. Furthermore, this extreme theological emphasis on God's power paved the way for thinkers like Luther to emphasize determinism, making the defense of human freedom and moral responsibility incredibly difficult.
This is the critical moment. The sources say that modernity begins not with triumph, but with this idea of self-rescue after order collapse.
And the nominalist shock established the three enduring problems that subsequent centuries desperately attempted to solve through our translation framework. First, how do you reconstruct knowledge certainty after reason was shown its limits?
Second, how do you secure human freedom and agency against an absolutely powerful and possibly arbitrary God?
And third, how do you establish social order legitimacy in a world of clashing subjective values? These three monumental questions are the true mother threads of modern Western thought.
So the system is broken, the cosmos is atomized, and God is inscrutable and, frankly, terrifying. The only place left to find any stability or meaning is within man himself.
Exactly. And that brings us to Renaissance and humanism, the elevation of man, which marks the first great decisive move of internalization.
The core of this chapter, as the sources put it, is the invention of individuality. The shift moves man from being merely a participant in the divine order, a role player in God's grand play, to being a self-certifier and a meaning maker.
Yes, and we see the psychological side of this in people like Petrarch. Amidst the chaos of the 14th century, he turns inward to find personal stability.
The external world is no longer reliable.
So personal experience and inner life become paramount. If external authority and cosmic order fail, the truth must reside within the subjective individual, who is now spotlighted as unique and special, rather than just an instance of a universal essence.
And this leads directly to what the sources call the deification of man. Pretty strong phrase.
It is, but it captures the philosophical crowning of man. Think of Pico della Mirandola's oration on the dignity of man. Man is his own shaper. This emphasis on human dignity, creativity, and agency is the profound positive effect of this whole movement.
It's the foundation for modern human rights, for personality independence, for the modern idea of self-reliance. It is liberating.
It is liberating, but that liberation comes with a massive cost. The burden of meaning.
Right. This is the crucial negative side of the translation. The weight of meaning shifts entirely to the individual. We move from receiving meaning from a divinely structured cosmos to having to produce meaning all by ourselves.
And conscience, now internalized, becomes the sole judge of virtue. But this immediately leads to the subjectivization and proliferation of values. If I define my good and you define yours, what happens when they clash violently? Who's the referee?
And that sets up immediate structural tensions for society.
Tension number one. The problem of adjudicating value conflicts. When values are subjective, there is no ultimate, external, universal arbiter. The search for a unifying highest good breaks down permanently, which foreshadows the later nihilism and cultural relativism.
And if that common theological belief is gone, the crisis of community integration has to follow.
The shared theological meaning net is torn. As intellectual elites embrace secular, classical, or individualistic values, the cohesive force of the religious community weakens. The common meaning is no longer guaranteed by the heavens.
And this must have been terrifying on a personal level. The subjective anxiety must have been overwhelming.
Oh, absolutely. The individual, now crowned as the creator of meaning and the center of certainty, suddenly faces immense spiritual pressure. You're isolated and exposed in an infinite, indifferent universe. You are no longer comfortably situated within a defined role in the chain of being.
You're on your own.
And the anxiety you see in thinkers of this era, seeking refuge in political cynicism or profound introspection, reveals the price of freedom, the immense burden of self-creation and self-justification.
The humanist elevation of man really set the stage for the next seismic event, which takes these intellectual anxieties of nominalism and turns them into a full-blown political and social crisis.
Yes, the Reformation crisis of salvation and community fissure.
This moves the challenge to authority from the philosophical schools into every single household in Europe. The core impact is immediately on salvation certainty.
Luther's justification by faith alone provides a kind of internal assurance. My conscience, my faith, not the priest or the ceremony, is what saves me. This radical internalization, but it simultaneously creates this profound predestination anxiety, especially in Calvinism.
Right. If salvation is predetermined by God's inscrutable will, how can I ever truly know if I possess true faith or if I'm among the elect?
It's terrifying. The subject is stripped of the protective layer of the church and is forced into a direct, unmediated confrontation with God's absolute will.
And this anxiety about internal faith immediately challenges the source of authority.
The principle of Scripture alone, sola scriptura, decentralizes interpretive authority. The final arbiter shifts from the monolithic church hierarchy to the text and the individual conscience reading that text. This shatters the consensus on truth.
Authority is lowered to the written word, but the interpretation is radically individualized.
Which leads rapidly to sectarian division and the collapse of the unified Christian world, what was called Christendom.
And the result is that faith stops being the social glue and becomes the catalyst for relentless political conflict, leading to brutal conflicts like the 30 Years' War.
This is the critical political consequence. Religious certainty failed to provide social cohesion. It provided violence and fragmentation. The legitimacy of common life becomes an existential problem that the secular state must now urgently solve.
This anxiety forces a dramatic spiritual structure reorganization through massive internalization and discipline.
Since the external means of grace are gone, religious certainty becomes fully internalized. The inner life, your conscience, becomes the primary battlefield for determining your eternal fate. This demands constant, intense self-examination and self-policing.
And this spiritual shift, the sources argue, leads directly to the cultural engine of modern capitalism, the Protestant ethic.
Following Max Weber's famous analysis, the Reformation transforms that terrifying rescue anxiety into a systematic psychological motivation for worldly diligence and strict self-discipline. He called it inner-worldly asceticism.
So earthly, systematic work and discipline success becomes a way to gain psychological assurance.
A sign, importantly not the cause, but a sign of potential election. You work hard not to get rich, but to alleviate the unbearable spiritual uncertainty you feel inside.
And this anxiety leads to the rationalization process, what Weber called the expulsion of magic.
Yes. The world is disenchanted, viewed pragmatically. Moral discipline becomes secularized, translated into a cultural tendency towards systematic efficiency, rational organization, and strict self-control. This tendency persists long after the religious fervor fades, paving the way for the capitalist spirit and bureaucratic efficiency. It's a critical act of naturalization, where a moral discipline becomes an economic and cultural structure.
And all this forces crucial political consequences, the politicalization of order.
The collapse of unified religious authority necessitates the rise of the sovereign state. The Westphalian system in 1648 formalized this new reality. The local ruler determines the local religion. Secular power has to take over the critical function of societal integration.
The state has to ensure peace because the theological consensus could not.
Exactly. And so the task of political philosophy shifts fundamentally. It shifts from the classical goal of promoting good, shaping the virtuous soul toward the highest good, to the modern, minimal, risk-averse task of avoiding evil.
Using contract, law, and force to maintain peace and prevent civil war.
It's a massive lowering of ambition driven by the trauma of religious conflict. And it sets up the next two great self-rescue projects. The intellectual one with Descartes and the political one with Hobbes.
The stage is set. We have theological rupture, social fragmentation, and terrifying existential uncertainty. We turn now to epistemological self-rescue, Descartes' certainty project.
This is the great intellectual response to the skepticism and anxiety unleashed by nominalism and the Reformation. Descartes' foundational motive was, well, it was desperate. The old external authorities had failed him.
So the goal was to counter this destructive skepticism and find an internal source of light and truth, independent of fragile external authorities, senses, tradition, the church, which had all been shown to be unreliable.
This is the key internalization move in epistemology. He sought to build a rational fortress against the terror of the unknowable God.
And he starts by sweeping the intellectual slate clean, using universal doubt.
He systematically screens out everything unreliable. The senses often deceive us. Tradition is just inherited opinion. He even posits the evil daemon hypothesis, that a powerful, malicious being could be deceiving him about mathematical truths and the external world.
He takes doubt to the absolute extreme.
To find the single point that cannot be doubted. And in the process of doubting everything, he discovers the one undeniable certainty.
Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am.
He establishes the subject, the thinking ego, as the first undeniable source of certainty. The mind's own activity becomes the ultimate self-certifying reference point. Knowledge is no longer dependent on a cosmic order. It is guaranteed by the inherent structure of the human mind itself.
But here is the fascinating twist the sources highlight. This new subject-centered system still needs help. Descartes still needed to reintroduce God. Why?
It's a brilliant point, because without God, his system falls right back into skepticism. How can the subject know that its clear and distinct ideas actually correspond to an objective reality outside the mind? Descartes needed a non-deceiving, perfect being to guarantee the objective reality of the external world and the trustworthiness of his own clear reasoning. He needs God to ensure that 2 + 2 = 4, and that the laws of geometry hold true outside his own head.
This is a perfect demonstration of the translation framework, specifically substitution.
Absolutely. God's ultimate function is translated from the highest being of scholasticism, the cosmic reasoner, into the purely functional guarantor of rational order in the Cartesian system. God is tamed.
He's no longer mysterious and willful.
He's reduced to a rational, predictable, causal entity, a necessary logical assumption that guarantees our mathematical and physical observations.
The sources even equate this pursuit of certainty with a secular version of soul salvation.
It is the ultimate shift. For the scholastic, soul salvation meant union with the highest good. For Descartes, philosophical clarity equals spiritual tranquility. The Certainty Project functions as a secular attempt at rescue from the spiritual and intellectual anxiety of the age. The subject is enthroned, but it still requires that translated divine function to complete the certainty engineering.
The new scientific knowledge structure is implicitly built on a secularized divine pillar.
If Descartes solved the internal cognitive problem, how I can be certain, the external social and political chaos of the Reformation remained utterly urgent.
And that brings us to political self-rescue. Hobbes' Order Project, offering the political solution to the theological crisis.
The context here is the English Civil War, which was the ultimate proof that the religious quest for the highest good only resulted in the greatest evil, anarchy, and violent death.
So Hobbes prioritized order amidst value fragmentation.
This is the crucial pragmatic shift that defines modern politics. Hobbes abandoned the search for a unifying highest good, knowing it was just divisive, and he appealed instead to the shared universal motivation to avoid the greatest evil, violent death.
If you can't agree on what to live for, you can at least agree that you want to avoid being killed by your neighbor.
It's a brutal but effective logic. He used fear as a constructive, rational driver, the wisdom of fear.
Hobbes's pessimistic, pragmatic anthropology is that humans are self-interested, power-hungry, and driven by fear.
And that fear is the rational motivator that drives them to leave the miserable state of nature. The social contract is formed when people cede their rights out of fear, creating the mortal god, the Leviathan. The ultimate political goal shifts from classical virtue politics to modern security and risk control.
A perfect textbook example of technicalization governance.
Absolutely. And the sovereign state becomes the new absolute, the key substitution in the political realm.
The state assumes ultimate legislative power and a monopoly on violence.
The sovereign takes over the ultimate authority that God once held in the secular sphere. The political scientist Carl Schmitt provided the essential insight here. Modern state concepts are fundamentally secularized theological concepts. The state is performing the function of the divine guarantor of absolute order on earth.
Can you elaborate on those specific traces of political theology?
Oh, you see them everywhere. First, the sovereign's indivisible singularity. No parallel power, whether it's the church, a local lord, or a faction, is tolerated. This corresponds directly to God's oneness and jealousy in the theological sphere.
Okay.
Second, the doctrine of original sin is translated into the brutal, realistic anthropological premise of human nature's self-interest, requiring necessary restraint and an absolute external force to keep the peace.
And the state essentially takes on the interpretive and disciplinary role of the church.
Absolutely. The state acts as the supreme ecclesiastical authority, monopolizing the interpretation of religious truth and doctrine to ensure civil peace. Hobbes recognized that faith breeds conflict, so he wanted to leverage the residual fear of the invisible into obedience to the visible physical government.
The purpose is maximum stability and control.
It is. The modern state's reliance on law and force to maintain cohesion is the direct legacy of this Hobbesian substitution.
The Hobbesian model is highly effective because it provides an immediate solution to the problems of nominalism and the Reformation, but it does so by sacrificing the quest for shared objective meaning.
Yes, it gives us peace, but it's a cold peace. It creates a structure of stability based on raw force and positive law, devoid of any inherent moral purpose. And as we move into the Enlightenment, we see what happens when the absolute certainty of the state is matched by the absolute certainty of science.
We now reach the Enlightenment rational expansion and contradiction intensification. This period is often celebrated as the height of modern achievement, but the sources we're looking at argue it's actually the moment where modernity's inherent contradictions created by those earlier translations become inescapable.
The vision was grand, there's no doubt. It was the triumphal narrative of reason, the triumph of natural law, best exemplified by the Newtonian universe, mathematically described, universally applicable, and perfectly predictable.
Universalism reigned. The belief was that the world was explainable and improvable through the application of universal rational principles. Freedom, equality, human rights to all rational beings. It was Kant's famous call. Dare to know, use your own intellect.
The promise was to shed the theological shadows entirely through pure reason. But here we encounter contradiction one. Increased explanatory power versus the difficulty of grounding meaning. The success of naturalization backfired.
How so?
The scientific success led to the thorough disenchantment of the world, as Weber argued. The cosmos is viewed purely as a machine, devoid of purpose, telos, or spiritual significance. The mechanical universe is silent on human destiny. This immediately leads to a profound meaning vacuum.
We solved the how, but fatally lost the why.
Exactly. This is the enduring fact-value chasm. Science can explain what is, the facts, the structures, the causes, but it cannot deduce what ought to be, the values. Value is relegated to subjective preference, like with Hume, or a self-imposed rational law, like with Kant. It's no longer derived from objective reality.
And the collapse of that traditional value stage brings existential anxiety.
Which is a direct prelude to 19th century despair and Nietzschean nihilism, the declaration that structurally God is dead as a cosmic guarantor of meaning.
Then there's contradiction two. Natural necessity versus subjective freedom.
The push for universal mechanical causes extends beyond planets to humans. Think of Lemaitrie's famous claim, man is a machine. This deterministic erosion of moral responsibility threatens the very foundation of free will and accountability, which humanism and the Reformation had struggled so hard to establish through internalization.
And this spills into our understanding of history itself.
Yes. The emerging idea of historical progress, seen in thinkers from Kant to Hegel and Marx, suggests history is a necessary unfolding process guided by laws, a kind of secularized version of providence. This fundamentally challenges the role of individual free choice.
And this contradiction is a direct result of our translation history.
It is. God's absolute sovereignty is translated into natural necessity or historical laws, while human freedom is derived from subjective rational autonomy. When pushed to their extremes, they clash violently.
Kant tries to split the difference between the phenomenal world, the necessary measurable world, and the noumenal world, the free world of moral choice. But the sources emphasize that this compromise is unstable.
It's intellectually elegant, but it is increasingly hard to maintain as science probes deeper into human psychology and biology. The modern person is left with an acute structural anxiety. Are we truly free agents making moral choices, or are we merely sophisticated machines obeying unseen natural laws?
Finally, contradiction three. Universalism versus community fragmentation.
Enlightenment universal principles, which are often abstract and rooted in a specific Western European intellectual history, meet nationalist, cultural, and particular specificities, leading to resistance and fragmentation. Abstract reason fails to provide the deep emotional and social communal bond that the church once offered.
Meet the struggle of the gods.
Precisely.
No.
With the church structure weaken, ideologies proliferate. Liberalism, socialism, nationalism, romanticism, each claiming rational support but clashing fundamentally over ultimate values. As Weber said, no single rational argument can unify these ultimate values. Abstract rationality fails to provide the soul of the community, leading to social alienation.
And so states must increasingly rely on administration and force rather than shared consensus to maintain cohesion.
So the Enlightenment didn't solve modernity's structural crisis. It merely intensified the inherent contradictions established by the earlier theological translations. Knowledge became more certain, but our existence became existentially insecure.
We've arrived at the synthesis point. Conclusion, the final account of modernity's crisis. This forces us to audit the historical ledger through the lens of those translation mechanisms.
This is the moment to clearly identify the three key substitutions that define the basic structural limits of the modern world.
Substitution 1. The subject replaces the source of truth.
This is the Cartesian legacy. The human rational subject is established as the ultimate standard for certainty. The ultimate standard for truth is internalized within us. If I can't be sure, the world can't be sure.
Substitution 2. Natural law replaces divine order.
Causal, mechanical laws, predictable, mathematical, become the primary framework for explaining the cosmos and society, replacing teleological or sacred order. The rule itself, the concept of a self-operating, predictable system, becomes the new absolute authority over explanation.
And substitution 3. The sovereign state replaces ultimate authority.
The state becomes the ultimate secular arbiter of order and social cohesion, taking over the ecclesial functions of final judgment and loyalty demand, as Hobbes so brutally ensured.
These substitutions successfully created functional systems, scientific knowledge, bureaucratic stability, but at a high price, which leads us to the three structural tensions that continue to plague us today.
Tension 1. The pursuit of certainty versus the space for freedom. The relentless drive for scientific, technical, and administrative certainty rules, regulations, bureaucracies inherently squeezes subjective flexibility and agency. This is the iron cage of rationality that Weber observed.
A highly efficient, perfectly logical system that traps us in a meaning vacuum.
Tension 2. Order governance versus legitimacy and meaning. Modern states achieve impressive stability and order through technical governance, the Hobbesian minimum, but stability itself does not provide a reason to live or a moral framework for society.
This results in an existential void at the heart of the social contract.
Loyalty to the state becomes fragile because it lacks a higher moral or existential purpose. People feel secure but hollow, leading to this anxious need for order for its own sake, rather than for the sake of a shared good.
And tension 3. Universal explanation versus individual existential anxiety.
Universal scientific knowledge clarifies how the physical world works, but is profoundly silent on who I am or why I matter. This knowledge eliminates ignorance, but paradoxically, amplifies individual insecurity and mental health crises because the individual feels isolated and cosmically insignificant in the face of vast, indifferent mechanical laws.
This analysis allows us to recalibrate our self-understanding. We have to realize that modernity is not the simple retreat of religion, but the inheritance and translation of a profound theological crisis.
And critically, the crises we face are not external accidents. They are structural byproducts of modernity's own successful solutions, the inherent limitations and shadow costs of choosing the subject, the law, and the state as our new absolutes. The solutions themselves created the problems.
Okay, so let's apply this historical and philosophical audit to today. Contemporary echoes facing the reality check. The persistence of these tensions in the 21st century is striking.
Look first at technical reason and the meaning vacuum. We are now at the extreme extension of quantifiable calculability AI, big data, hyper-efficient systems. We are calculating everything, yet often feel existentially paralyzed, not knowing what is worthy of pursuit.
The gap between explanatory power and ultimate meaning has never been wider.
We are becoming, as the sources referenced, specialists without spirit, sensualists without heart.
This gap is the continuation of the Enlightenment's fundamental contradiction. We have all the data, but no guidance.
Precisely. The second echo is the security state and the contraction of freedom. We see the relentless expansion of the security logic, risk control, predictive policing, and mass surveillance. This is the ultimate high-tech realization of Hobbes' principle, exchanging fundamental freedoms for order based on fear governance.
The zero-sum game of freedom versus safety is constantly reproduced, often with the public willingly granting the state more control in exchange for perceived security from abstract risks, whether from terrorism, climate change, or pandemics.
This is a classic Hobbesian sovereignty move. When the threat, the greatest evil, is perceived to be large enough, the sovereign's power expands to encompass the state of exception, and individual rights are compressed. This tension between necessary security and encroaching state power is the constant reenactment of Hobbes' solution being stretched to its limit.
Third, the chaos of value pluralism and social media dislocation. Our current hyperpolarization and culture wars are the persistent effect of the Enlightenment's failure to provide a single, unifying moral language.
Public life has devolved into a power struggle without shared moral ground. Everyone is operating from their own internalized subjective value system. And what's particularly dangerous today is the rise of identity politics, which moves drastically away from universal human foundations, the humanist legacy, toward group antagonism and competition.
This is the modern continuation of the post-Reformation community schism.
Where abstract universalism breaks down into warring factions seeking dominance rather than consensus. And finally, the surprising religious resurgence, filling the modern void.
Right.
The return of religious or quasi-religious movements globally is not a random throwback. It is a structural response to modernity's failure to satisfy the deep human need for ultimate meaning, transcendent identity, and stable belonging. Habermas notes that we live in a post-secular society.
When secular rationality fails to provide the soul, a profound vacuum opens up, and religion in all its forms naturally rushes to fill it.
And sometimes secular ideologies themselves perform that religious function. Secular forms of absolutism, whether extreme nationalism, radical political movements promising utopia, or cults of personality, also act as secular religions.
Demanding absolute loyalty and providing a sense of ultimate meaning and belonging that rational bureaucratic governance just cannot supply.
These are the new idols created to satisfy the non-eliminable need for the transcendent.
We've reached our final reflections, then, in the revelation of the translation history.
The ultimate lesson here seems to be the non-eliminable nature of ultimate concern. The human need for certainty, for purpose, for a stable identity structure. It can't just be reasoned away.
The death of God did not end the human need for the divine. It simply led to the creation of new idols and potentially new ideological or bureaucratic cages.
We didn't solve the structural problem of purpose. We merely outsourced the ultimate authority to new secular absolutes, the subject, the law, and the state.
So the task of reflection for us is to move beyond either a blind, utopian faith in the modern project or a simple reactionary nostalgia for a past that can never return.
Understanding this history of translation, how these problems migrated from the theological sphere to the political and cognitive spheres, is the key to finding a future path. We have to recognize that our crises are structural, inherited problems rooted in centuries of intellectual compromises, not just random political failures that a new administration or a new technology can fix.
Which brings us to the core concluding insight.
Modernity inherited a theological crisis, and humanity must soberly reflect on the limits of its secular absolutes, the subject, the law, and the state. We have to find a way to honor the genuine achievements of modernity, its freedoms and its knowledge, while re-engaging with the necessity of ultimate meaning. We need to understand the structural limits of our own solutions, lest the iron cage continues to tighten.
This entire deep dive has laid bare the complex truth. The modern promise, the idea that we could be perfectly autonomous, perfectly rational, and perfectly secure, came with an immense and unavoidable price tag.
The price was the existential void, the fact-value chasm, and the constant tension between freedom and structure. We traded teleological purpose for mechanical efficiency, and now we wonder where the meaning went.
And that leaves us, the modern inheritors of this centuries-long translation, with a crucial final thought to ponder. If we successfully push God out of our systems, replacing him with the subject, the law, and the state, what new absolute are you relying on today for certainty and meaning? And what price are you paying for that certainty in terms of your own freedom and the fragmentation of your community?
And given that modern stability, as Hobbes taught us, relies fundamentally on fear, the universal motivation to avoid the maximum evil, what foundational value, other than fear, could possibly unify society today without forcing us to sacrifice the pluralism and hard-won individual freedoms that we cherish?
A profound challenge for you to carry forward as you look at the news tomorrow. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.